Okay, I think we're going to get started. There will be some others joining us that are just in the waiting room right now as we check names off a list. So welcome. I'm so pleased to see so many people joining our workshop this afternoon. My name is Nancy Dubois, and I've been one of the consultants working on the project with CPRA around gender equity over the last couple of years with Krista Costas-Bradstreet, who you'll meet shortly if you haven't already. What I'd like to take us through first is just a little bit of a technology check, and then we'll go into some of the background information. I just need to change my view here just a second. Um, no, I can't see anybody. Okay. So if we go to the tech check slide, this will give us a few rundowns. I'm sure lots of this is a reminder. So MJ, if you could flip to the next slide, please. We would ask that you keep your mute button on until we get into conversation. And we would really, really appreciate your video being turned on. It's difficult enough to have an interactive session online. And it's even more difficult when we can't see the people who we're trying to interact with. So unless there's some real difficult reason for you not to, we would really appreciate your video. If you would make sure your name is on your screen and whatever way you want it to be known, and certainly feel free to add your pronouns to that as well. You do have some options to view the presentation. We will have slides for the better part of it, unless we're in the breakout rooms. So feel free to move back and forth between the gallery and the speaker view, whichever your choice is. In order to do that, there's a line down the middle that you can slide from one side to the other to make either the people or the slides larger. We would ask that in the chat box, if you understand that the broadcast goes to everyone on the call, and that we will be restricting you, if you wouldn't mind, to not put URLs in there. They tend to carry viruses with them sometimes, so we'll do it when we need to, but we ask that you not include those there. When it's time to chime in with thoughts, please use your raise hand icon. There are enough people on the call that we can't see everyone on the same screen. So if you're just waving your hand, we're not going to be able to see it very well, or maybe not at all. So in your icons at the bottom, in the reactions button, you'll see a bar across the bottom that says raise hand. That will put a little hand in the window. And then when you're finished, just toggle that switch again and it'll lower your hand. The last thing I wanted to let you know about is that we will be recording this. You should have gotten that as a message when you arrived. And the reason for that is for posterity, to be able to include it in our toolkit on gender equity, which you'll hear a little bit more about as we go forward in the presentation. We're going to take a short commercial message here and show you an introductory video to the workshop by Aaron Love, who's the National Director of Programs for CPRA. So MJ is going to play the video, and it will take about 5 minutes, I think, to go through. So here we go.
Hi, and welcome. My name is Erin Love. I'm the Director of National Programs at the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the Gender Equity in Recreational Sport Workshop Series, focusing on optimizing facility use and design. These workshops are a culmination of efforts that over the last year and a bit have involved an environmental scan, literature review, key informant interviews, and surveys involving researchers and recreation practitioners across Canada and internationally. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to CPRA and the work that we're doing focusing on gender equity in recreational sport. As many of you may know, the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association is the national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as major contributors to community health and vibrancy. CPRA is a voice. We're the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members. CPRA is a community. We're a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities in the natural and built environments. We are also a resource. So CPRA is a resource for the sector, and we contribute knowledge and opportunities to enhance growth. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well as I introduce the bench to you in a few slides. What makes CPRA so special is that we are a collective network of the 13 provincial and territorial parks and recreation associations across Canada. They make up our membership. And our strength really comes from the experience, the expertise, and the network of the staff and board members that we have across this great country. We also work with volunteers, government partners, a number of allied health sector partners as well, such as public health, education, sport, physical activity, and a whole host of other groups. They help us progress on our goals, and in turn, we strive to help them meet theirs. CPRA has a virtual office with about 8 staff. And although the staff work remotely, the CPRA National Office is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Métis First Nations. We acknowledge the historical oppression of the lands, cultures, and the peoples in what we now know as Canada. And we aim to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together. So a moment ago, I referenced the bench. The bench is an online community that CPRA launched in the summer of 2020. It's a place for the sector to meet, to grow, to work, to share together. And the bench features a whole host of different tools and resources. It's an events or a list of upcoming events. There are discussion groups, one in particular that's focused on gender equity. There are portals dedicated to specific projects, such as the Framework for Recreation in Canada and Parks for All. There are some professional development opportunities, and as well as COVID-19 and other resources. As the bench grows, you'll also find other discussion groups start to pop up. So we really encourage you to sign up for the bench, take a look around, join some discussion forums if some spark your interest. You'll also find some templates, some tools, some guidelines, and other documents to help you in the work that you're doing. And here's a video of the bench. CPRA's current project that focuses on gender equity in recreational sport was funded back in November 2019. This funding came from the Government of Canada, from Sport Canada at the time, to increase participation and retention of women and girls in recreational sport in Canada. Through our work and over the past few years, we still, of course, focus on girls and women, but we've included non-binary folks as well in the work that we do. Our key populations for this work are girls aged 9 to 15, new moms or women in the postpartum period, older adults 55 and up, as well as girls and women with intersecting identity factors. And what we know is that these key priority groups face additional barriers to participation and retention. And the work that we're doing helps to address those and remove them. CPRA, as part of this work, has designed and delivered a number of different pieces to this project. So there is a facility use and design toolkit, of which this webinar series will be a part. There are other workshops that we've delivered in partnership with Canadian Women in Sport and some local facilitators across the country. We have also delivered a webinar series. You'll find all of this on our website and on our YouTube page. We've worked as well with High Five. Many of you may know the High Five training program, and we've enhanced High Five sport module and also developed 4 new modules that practitioners can take. They're free, and I encourage you to check those out as well. We've also offered some community grants through this work. Those have gone to grassroots efforts across Canada to address those barriers that women, girls, and non-binary people face when participating in sport and recreation. There's a whole host of work that CPRA is doing in this area, and we would like to thank our partner, the Government of Canada, for funding to do all of these initiatives. This funding or this project supports the 2018 federal funding commitment to achieve gender equity in sport at every level by 2035. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and our workshop facilitator. I wish you all the best on this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you all on the bench.
I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Krista Costas-Bradstreet, who is going to frame some of the issues with respect to gender equity for us. So Krista, over to you.
Thanks, Nancy. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many people, as Nancy said earlier. So what I wanted to do is 2 things: give you a little bit of an overview in terms of what the facts and stats are around this issue. It is a pressing issue for sure. And I also want to start to frame this from the perspective of the recreation framework. So the framework for recreation, which sort of guides the recreation sector, has 5 goals: active living, access and inclusion, connecting people with nature, supportive environment, and recreation capacity. And I would say gender equity fits into all of these 5, probably with a particular focus, if you're familiar with the framework, on active living and access and inclusion. And in fact, in the access and inclusion goal, there is a specific priority around women and girls and non-binary folks. So this is one of the reasons that CPRA is so involved in this, and also the fact that recreational sport is not a topic that's necessarily been addressed as much. And so where our, I guess, interest in this is really the facts and stats around this issue. And so much of these come from, or many of these come from, Canadian Women in Sport, who I know actually are on the call today. And so gender equity is an issue. 62% of Canadian girls are not participating in any kind of sport. In 1992, so several years ago, just over half of women aged 15 or older were participating in sport. But in 2020, that dropped to 18% of women aged 16 to 23. A similar number of boys and girls start out in sport, but boys stay involved in sport much later through to adolescence and across the lifespan. So in fact, 1 in 3 girls drop out of sport versus 1 in 10. And then factors that prevent girls from participating include low confidence, negative body image, poor perceptions of belonging, and feelings of unwelcomeness. Currently, and this is a newer report, again, from CWS around the impact of COVID on girls in sport. We know that currently 1 in 4 females are not committed to returning to sport after COVID-19. And in the history of our being, women are always, and girls, less physically active than men. So whether it's the amount of time spent or steps taken. So for example, 53% of men take at least 7,500 steps, while only 6% of women do. And then the same is true again of those that are actually obtaining 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. 52% of men do, whereas 46% of women do. So we know that this is an issue. We think that it gets some attention sometimes, but probably not to the extent that it should, given that women and girls make up 50% of the population. So it is with that lens in mind that we're running these workshops, and in the hope that we can make a contribution to enhancing gender equity by 2035, as is the Sport Canada goal. Back over to you. I muted myself before I said that.
Thanks, Krista. I'd like to now introduce to you our facilitator for today, Claire Tucker-Reid. Claire is a recreation and sport consultant in Ontario, specializing in master plans, policy development, organizational assessments, and service delivery reviews. She's enjoyed a stellar career in public service and is known for always reaching higher. Her work typically emphasizes her dedication to including the voices of marginalized residents and staff. Some highlights include Claire hosted the premier municipal race relations conference in Ontario for the city of Markham in 1989. As a commissioner of public works, Claire worked on all of the garbage, street, animal control, roads, water, forestry, and parks crews to better understand each staff member's work, build stronger relationships, and capture staff needs in forming a high-performing team. Claire developed the first diversity and community engagement plan for the town of Ajax by having all underrepresented voices at the table, creating a long-term opportunity for groups to support each other and respect everyone's need to be seen and belong. She hosted women's golf lessons annually so that female municipal staff could learn a new sport and participate competently in corporate golf tournaments. Claire is currently completing a chapter in a book through the Global Leadership Institute on Courageous Women in Leadership. This book speaks to women's experiences and leadership challenges and is authored by contributors from Zimbabwe, South Africa, Canada, the Netherlands, and the United States of America. So, Claire, I'll turn things over to you, and we'll see bits and pieces of the rest of us as we go through this afternoon. Welcome.
Good show. Thanks so much, both Nancy, MJ, and Krista. Before I start the workshop, I just want to acknowledge the phenomenal leadership that we've received through the project. Nancy, Krista, CPRA have involved a nationwide reference group, completed an international literature search, and consulted the field on current and future needs. It's an impressive body of work. And on behalf of girls, women, and gender diverse people in the field of sport and recreation, we thank you for your continued dedication in keeping this issue front and center. You've created a sense of urgency, and I know we've seen this before, but this data, workshops, the resources you're providing is going to help us along our journey. And we thank you once again for giving this call to action. I'd like to just quickly go through the pre-reading materials before we get into the content. The first Why Work Culture is Important is a great resource. It just speaks to why work culture is important in forming, having those discussions, providing those guidelines for staff as we go about our work. The second one, Brown Girls Outdoor World, is a phenomenal community-based initiative, and we will also talk about that to a greater extent as we move along. Now, the Canadian Women in Sport, just referring to number 4, the temperature check, is known very much so for their creation of the movement to increase women, girls, and gender diverse people's participation in sport. And they've developed a temperature check, which is an audit tool that helps you assess your organization in terms of policies and practices, organizational culture, and readiness. We'll use the tool again later on in the workshop as well. But if you haven't already, please go to their website. They will help you in your journey, and they actually have staff and volunteers and consultants that will come to your organization or work remotely, most likely these days, and just audit what's in place. How is the community involved? What are the likely first steps, etc. And we've really seen some great work with the Canadian Women in Sport and the town of Aurora. We completed, as a consulting team, completed their, it was a parks and recreation plan, but also a sport plan. And my work was to do the sport plan, and we recommended that they focus more on re-engaging females in sport. From that point, they've hired staff, They've reviewed their policies. They've done the audit with CSW. So I'm going to refer to her a little bit throughout the workshop because I think they're an example of a team that's taken on this cause, but worked with community and has developed some really great tools, groups, and we hope to see great things. I'm just going to go through the workshop overview. So both Krista and Nancy, as I said, worked with and consulted a tremendous number of females in sport and recreation. And they've asked for specific workshops on specific topics to help them along. And so the workshop today is around building that supportive culture and welcoming environment, understanding intersectionality, that females identify differently and in many ways. So we need to ensure that our facilities, programs, and community stakeholder groups can provide welcoming environments, but really the key emphasis is to listen. And then strengthening the commitment in the community, within organizations, amongst organizations and groups, through social hubs and disrupting social norms. So that's the broad overview, and we'll get into the specifics. I'd like to introduce a video to demonstrate sport participation barrier from Sport England's perspective. They've done a tremendous amount of work. They parallel CSW in Canada. But Lisa O'Keefe has been the director of Insight and with Sport England since 2013. Her work is to better understand behaviors, motivations, and participation around sport. She played rugby for Scotland. She's been part of many teams that have won international, I think 45 in all, rugby cups and numerous World Cups. She's a real dynamo, and we had the privilege of interviewing Lisa as part of the preparation for this series. So she's going to speak to us about why females don't join or drop out of sport and recreation.
Thank you, Lisa, so much for joining us today. And we're going to launch into our first question. Could you tell us a little bit about the research that was done initially that identified 3 particularly strong fears that women and girls bring to a physical activity setting?
Yes, of course. So 6 years ago it is now, we sat down with all of the available research that looked at the very many barriers that were stopping women and girls taking part in sport and physical activity. And we largely put them into 3 groupings. So we found, first of all, that there were a large number of barriers which were connected to ability. So our perception of our ability to take part in that activity. If I turn up at that sports club, will I be able to keep up with everybody else? Will I be able to catch and throw like everybody else? Will I stand out? Because clearly I am not as good as everyone else. Often you hear people talk about, I need to get fit enough before I can go to the gym. And it is such a significant emotional barrier for all of us, and it's that voice in our head which says, don't be daft, you don't fit in there. So that's the first one, ability. The second one, we found there were a lot of barriers connected with appearance. And again, this is about wanting to fit in. So it may be, I just don't have all the kit that everybody else has. It may be that I am clearly a different shape, or I'm a different age, or I'm a different ethnicity from everybody else. I'm just going to look different. As much as we like to think we're all individuals, we do want to be part of the crowd. We want to be able to blend in. So that appearance anxiety is very profound in sport and physical activity, because it's an environment where you're very exposed in a lot of ways. And the last one was connected with taking time out for ourselves. So a lot of women were reporting that they felt anxious and they felt judged if they took even 20 or 30 minutes out in the day to look after themselves. they talked a lot about all of their other commitments to other members of the family, to their work, to their friends. And there was a struggle and an anxiety that if I take time out solely for me, I will be judged for that. And that's the kind of wraparound for me. So you have those three different anxieties, but they all come under one umbrella, which is fear of judgment. It's that fear that we will be judged for being different, for being wrong, for making bad choices under these three headings. And quite often it is that voice in our head. So we don't even need our friends or our family or our colleagues to comment. We are already feeling it. And a lot of society's messages reinforce against all three of those barriers.
From all the various initiatives that you've undertaken, from campaigns to the research and such, have you learned anything from things that didn't work?
You learn from things that don't work all the time. I mean, genuinely, you know, whether it be on a grand scale, when I realised that I was spending all my time focusing on how to change the individual and not the whole system around them, whether it be, I mean, actually, when it comes to women and girls, a really good example of where I've learned a massive lesson. I thought in my naivety when I started all of this, that once I understood fear of judgment and I understood the three elements of it, all I had to do was create a campaign where I talked about fear of judgment. I reassured women that they were not the only one who felt like that many of us feel like that, and we all have our version of it. So, you know, it's not just you, it's all of us. And I would create a campaign that said, it's okay, you know, it's not a big deal, this is okay. And I was so wrong, because what I learned is that women who are regularly active still have that fear of judgment. It never goes, but they manage it. And I'll give you an example of that. I spoke to women about a month ago, and she said to me, she asked me what I did, and I said, well, I'm Insight Director at Sport England. And she said, oh, I don't do any sport. And when I tell people what I do, that's often they feel they need to tell me what they do sport-wise. I don't do any sport, Lisa, that's not my thing. I was like, oh, okay. And I said to her, well, do you do any exercise at all? You know, do you fit stuff in your day? And she said, oh, yeah. Well, I go out jogging twice a week. And I was like, oh, okay. That feels quite sporty to me, jogging twice a week. And I said to her, how far do you go? And she said, well, I run 4 miles. And I was like, oh, that's a long way, 4 miles. And she said, yeah. She said, actually, my preferred route is 3 miles. But I do 4 because I don't want to run past a row of shops where often there's some kids outside and they laugh at me, or they make a comment about the size of my bum, or they comment about the gear that I'm wearing. So in order to avoid all of them, I do this extra loop, which adds about a mile on. Classic example of managing that fear of judgment. It's exactly the same when a colleague at work says to you, oh, do you fancy joining the gym? And you kind of sort of put them off for a wee while, and then you go onto Google and you try really hard to find pictures of that place. What's it like? Who's in there? What classes are there? You try to imagine yourself in there. These are all the strategies we have for managing that fear, whether it be that appearance, ability, or taking time out for ourselves. So you will find lots of examples of everybody doing that every single minute of the day. And that's the biggest thing I learned. And you know, I often talk about the fact that I got that so wrong, but it's through doing the work that I do and really working hard to try and understand it, I recognize my mistakes, and I'm the first to talk about them as well, because we only learn, and we're actually trying very hard in our organisation to create a culture where people don't fear making mistakes, because often when we work in the public sector, it feels like if you make a mistake, that's a big deal, and you're getting into a lot of trouble for that because we're investing public money. But if we don't try and innovate, if we don't take risks, if we don't try and do things in a different way, we will never achieve our aim here of helping the nation move more. So yeah, I think we should talk more about them and embrace them.
Thanks, Nancy. The next slide speaks to just a summary of that research and the overall fear of judgment and the, whether they have the proper gear or other people are better than they are, or being judged or feeling guilty because they're leaving family at home. And I think we've seen practitioners really address this. We have women-only swims, we have family opportunities, we have segregated spots for women to work out in gyms. I think we're seeing that response in practitioners, but I think we even need to investigate these fears at a greater issue. But we want to provide you with this slide. We think it's a great resource to begin the conversation when you're speaking with staff. But this point really hit home for me and my family. Just a few months back, we took our grandchildren, Kensington, who's 7, our grandson, Charlie's 4, and we took them to a local skateboard park with their skateboards, or their scooters, sorry, they have skateboards, but they took their scooters. And they ride along Dundas Street in the city of Toronto to school on their scooters. They are very competent. They can scoot around people. They're really good at it. But once we got there, I noticed Charlie, who's 4, he was, running into people. He didn't know the flow, but it was okay. He'd get down and get up, and then he figured out eventually. Kensington was skateboarding on the periphery, and she kind of stood back and watched and was a bit hesitant, even though she's more skilled. And I said, "What's up?" And she said, "Well, there's no girls here." And I said, "Oh, well, you've got the skills. We'll just figure out, the route and we'll be fine." And she did get on once, but she stood, would rather skate in the periphery on the sidewalk, et cetera. And so she didn't join in. And this fear really hit home for this really confident 7-year-old. It hit me. Wow, this fear is very powerful. So we, just as a family, we came back many times. The park was less busy, so she gained some practice and some confidence. And, we came back, joined in, enjoyed the experience. But you can easily see how people sense and determine there aren't people that look like them quickly. And so they have this feeling that they don't belong. And she didn't see herself in the other people at the park. But extend that thinking, extend that fear to all underrepresented and marginalized females. And you can understand why we have this nationwide dilemma. It's innate, you feel it, and it stops you immediately. So we tend to have a lot of work to do. So I would like to discuss this just a little bit further in large group format. And Nancy will monitor the chat, and I'll watch for raised hands, although I'm on my iPad today, so it might be a little challenge if the other facilitators can help me out. And Nancy, you've already explained the raised hand feature, but I want to know, how do you currently address these fears around female participation, fear of judgment, appearance, ability, and spending time in the delivery of sport and recreation? Are you doing specific things? And how do you think we could be more intentional as service providers? So big group, raise hands or let us know let's address number 1. How do you or your organization currently address these fears in the delivery of sport and recreation? Any comments? Anything being done currently? Any ideas how you think we could be more intentional? Nancy,
I
you're
would like to hop in. It's Barb McKee and I'm from Red Deer. I'm the recreation superintendent and I'm not smart enough to figure out how to put up my hand with the tools below. So I apologize.
No worries.
Yeah. You know, when I look at the second question, my answer to the first is going to include the fact that I don't think we're as intentional as we should be. We have been able to take advantage of some opportunities that have come along. And so this past year, partnership with Sport Check has allowed us to sort of change the actual appearance of some of our change rooms in our hockey arenas. So they've been painted out to really emphasize provide a welcome and inclusive environment for girls. So messaging specifically around women in sport and providing products in those change rooms that are geared towards women. So some of those sponsorship opportunities have led us down the path of trying to address fears. And it's not like we don't just put women in those change rooms, we put boys and men in them too. So it's trying to change some of the mindset across our community. And then we do offer some targeted programming that is girl specific when it comes to sport. So trying to break down the barriers of, you know, you have to be proficient at something. It's their try it type of activities that are girls only, just trying to create a safe space to allow kids to try things and play. So those are a couple things that come to mind for me in Red Deer.
Great. Thanks, Barb. There
Mary,
were a couple of things in the chat room.
yeah,
Nancy?
we've got a couple of comments. One from Christina that had never really thought about that from a fear of judgment perspective, but it really makes sense that it's kind of when you do take time to think about it, it's real. And Kimberly says, when advertising a program highlighting women and girls in the space.
Excellent. Terrific. Any other comments on these? We have an excellent example in Ontario where there was a swim club and parents were typically watching their kids for 2 hours practice competitive swimming. And the coaching staff went to the parents and said, hey, what can we do to get you to be more active? And the parents said, well, you know, we'd like to be coached in swimming too. So they saved 2 lanes for the parents. And then at the end, they had a scheduled game, water game with everyone. And I think it got more adults involved, including women, and got them feeling safe in this environment and comfortable and welcome. So I think the key here is to ask the questions, in a safe environment, to listen, and as we've heard, just try things, tweak things, and I think we can make incremental change for sure. I think we'll move on to personal and systems readiness, and it helps to identify an organization or community's readiness in addressing this movement. As I said, in 2015, I was part of a team that developed both Sparks Parks and Recreation as well as sport plan for the town of Aurora. And the mayor and council have declared we will be the fittest town in Canada. So you can see this systems readiness. You know, if the mayor makes that declaration, there's going to be resources and plans and engagement toward that. That, I think, is the optimum. And the sport community developed their own position paper, which was really encouraging. They had their own thoughts about how the sport system could be better supported. And we felt that the town was ready to address gender equity in 2015. And as I said earlier, we've seen resounding results. And they've made great strides in engaging more people. I think as I said, they're working with the Canadian Women in Sport organization, but there was that clear readiness. There isn't always that clear readiness, and often it's 1 or 2 people that are motivated in an organization. And I think that, you know, if we can understand and collect data and influence others, there will be this ripple effect throughout organizations. But MJ, are we able to use Mentimeter for the slide 12? I know we were going to at one point.
Yeah, But I think the question we have is the first question we have was about intersectionality framework.
Okay, all right. I know we were talked about this at one point, but no problem whatsoever. Let's just go through the points on the slide. Often, I think the greatest readiness is that it's been deemed a corporate priority. So you have a mandate of sorts within your organization. The human rights legislation and current policies and practices, we know that we don't have a clean slate in terms of equity, in terms of allocation of space within organizations, with supporting, having more female coaches, all of those sorts of things. But I think that it is a point of readiness that people need to understand that there are inequities, even if you need to collect the data. We know from a national perspective there are, but collecting the data within your organization. And when I go in and do a plan, I try to collect how many community sport groups service males versus females. And then there's quantifiable data for that organization. I think if we can do a bit of our homework, we can create that readiness as a group. So I think just making the difference as a community, working together as a collective, will help persuade the right people to dedicate those resources. But it's much easier if you do have that mandate. And we'll talk later about how consultants who do plans for municipalities and organizations can influence that thinking. We're going to move on to organization or group culture. And I know these are building blocks, but I think defining an organizational or group culture is job one. It is most important. Whenever I go into an organization or I'm part of a group, I want to sit and say, what is our culture here as a team? And what are our values? And how does that translate into behaviors? And what behaviors are not acceptable as part of our work together? I did some work for the Boys and Girls Club of Toronto. We were looking at a policy, and there was a group of both practitioners, members, board members, myself, and we had a very difficult policy change to address. And I said, I'd like to spend the first 20 minutes of the work just talking about the culture that we want to embrace as a team. And we did, and a couple of people thought it was a crazy thing to do, but at the end, just felt that we'd set the groundwork for excellence in our work together. So it really is the major determinant of success. It's the competitive advantage, but not just of an organization, even of a group working together. I don't think we spend enough time on this, and it really doesn't need to be a lot of time. What I tend to do is I'll capture that, values, behaviors, and I get the team to sign off on as a charter of engagement, if you will. And it sets the tone. It really gives people the opportunity to talk about the best organization or the best group that they've ever worked in or heard of, and can we apply those values and behaviors to this team? It also creates a real aura of positivity and can-do attitude. So don't skip this one if you feel that it's just a quick thing and you can put it down on a piece of paper or ignore it altogether. You can't. If you are engaging diverse populations, you really need to understand what's important, what values important, what terminology is acceptable and not acceptable. And if you can do those things up front, it's really setting a strong groundwork for the future. When I was working in the town of Ajax on their first diversity and community engagement plan, I proposed that we have a steering committee made up of diverse cultures, backgrounds, It was intersectionality at the table at its finest. But there were different trains of thought, different values, etc. We had completed this community survey, and which is representing a very diverse population in Ajax. And people said, we want to feel that sense of belonging. And so the steering committee decided that our culture needed to reflect what the community wanted. And we witnessed as a result that there were groups that typically wouldn't support each other. They began to understand, because they had this common element, we all want to belong and help out. So we saw this huge change where groups that typically would never go to each other's events or help out at them did. They could embrace it because we took the time, again, to talk about culture. The next slide is, or the next is a video on Netflix corporate culture. It's one of their pillars of their corporate culture at Netflix. There are a few pillars, but I like the one on allyship. I find it particularly relevant to our workshop today around respecting differences, being intentionally inclusive, intersectionality, and creating welcome environments. Notice how people describe themselves and how allyship is embedded in their behaviors. We play the clip.
Hello.
What's going down?
Oi.
Hi.
مرحبا أنا نوف.
Konnichiwa.
Vamos a hablar.
This is about you.
This is about us.
I'm a father of 4 amazing kids.
A dancer, but only in my bedroom.
A believer in the power of stories.
Soy bilingüe, casi trilingüe.
An engineer, a nerd.
Sou lésbica. Eu sou amiga.
Japanese, Korean.
Palestinian, a German national.
An immigrant, East Asian American woman of color.
And a Zamiltak.
あなたも私の同僚です。
We make amazing things together.
We aspire to bring joy
to the entire world.
But
You and I inhabit different worlds.
You and I have access to different spaces.
unless you've experienced it, you can never fully understand what it's like to be stuck between 2 cultures.
To pretend to be someone else in order to be safe.
To grow up in South America in Spanish, and at 19 having to relocate to the US and live in English.
To be a Black gay man from the rural South.
And be the only one in the room.
Unless you've experienced it yourself, you can never really know what it's like.
To have to listen to someone be degrading to your race and be the only person of that race in the room.
To lose friends, family, co-workers, simply because you wanted to be who you are.
To not know whether you can call the country that you love home.
To be the father of a trans daughter.
I think we all have a responsibility to make the world that we live in a little bit better. And you kind of have to start where you are.
What allyship is listening, compassion.
To immerse yourself in content and experiences and stories from groups that aren't of your own.
Anybody who sees something that isn't quite right can become an ally and help their colleagues.
When you've been through a struggle that hurt you for such a long time, I think you have this endless energy to give to others.
Anyone can be an ally, and everyone can use an ally, and you can use your privilege in the moment to extend that privilege to someone else.
I think this is what makes us human, to help others and to be empathetic.
We're all learning.
We're all learning.
E tá todo mundo aprendendo.
Mabad.
Together.
Juntos.
There's one company.
We can all be allies.
We can all be allies.
Thank you. What I liked about this is that it reflects the people that you want into your sports and recreation facilities, but also building that cohesion as a group is to gain that understanding of one's background and what their preferences are. The temperature check I talked about previously, and you did get an example in your pre-reading package, And as I said, CFW has developed many resources to assist communities and groups in addressing gender equity in sport and recreation. And the temperature check allows an organization to audit what exists and what could exist, as well as assist the organization in setting priorities as they move along this journey. The temperature check was included, as I indicated, but the next two slides really talk about not how to build a culture, but the evidence of a strong culture within your organization or within your sport group, or within the community of sport within a municipality. And so if you can see the next two slides just quickly, I'll run through a couple, but using inclusive language, I think, is one that's very important. And we're seeing organizations, corporations developing these terminology, almost dictionaries. This is what is not acceptable, now this is what is acceptable, so that they're encouraging staff to not make these mistakes and be abreast of what the terminology is that is appropriate in this day and age. I just want to talk quickly about appreciative inquiry. So it was pioneered by David Cooperrider and Suresh Shrivasta in the 80s to garner the most out of group discussions. So I use appreciative inquiry to ensure that the discussion, we get the utmost out of everybody. The approach asks the group to imagine the best possible scenario and talk about how the group may employ these approaches. So if you were looking at a culture within your organization or your collective, you could ask, what about the most impressive equity-seeking organizations? We just heard one about within Netflix. What values are in place? So what is the best we've seen? And what are the behaviors and the values and behaviors that would support that? And what behaviors would not be acceptable in this scenario? And so I think by articulating both what's the best and what's the worst, then I think we get the best out of those discussions. Now, as I said, any time I work with groups, I like to start with developing a value system, but at the same time, I use appreciative inquiry to begin the conversation. I find it refreshing. I like to think of the best and think that I could achieve the best with being a part of this collective. And we'll have the opportunity to apply appreciative inquiry in your group work in just a minute. The next slide speaks to just a sample of values that might support increasing female participation in sport and recreation. So we're intentional about our work. Well, what are the behaviors that would support that? We're stronger together, so that sense of collective impact, that we can achieve greater things by working closer together. And then equity, not treating everybody the same. We need to take different approaches to include people with differing backgrounds, etc. So I wanted you to have this so you could see what a charter of engagement might look like in developing increasing participation. Are there any comments about this sample framework? Would it be helpful? Okay, we're going to go into, oh, there we go, very helpful, thank you. It has been, I think it's worked well for me. I'm just sending along and sharing and hope it can work well for you too. I have to say, when I was working in the city of Toronto, we had amalgamated 2 levels of government, 7 municipalities. We had 48,000 staff, 250 organizations that supported either agencies, boards, or commissions. And we had to create the culture for the organization. So we gathered early adopters and influencers, people that were from these organizations that seemed to be enthusiastic, dedicated, influence others, etc. And we got folks together to discuss the results of a corporate survey around values and behaviors. And we articulated it, what the public service now is and what those behaviors and values were. And that was enforced in many ways, but I think, again, as I've said before, it's an effective first step. We're going to go into breakout rooms, and group one, what were the thoughts in terms of what values would be in play in terms of the most impressive equity-seeking organizations or collectives? What values would you expect to witness?
It'll be me, Claire, so I'll jump in.
Okay.
Our group talked about 3 or 4 of these. One was the desire to approach the community service role with a sense of curiosity, to be able to understand gaps and needs in the community and not being sort of complacent with the people who are always there. So that was one. And another one that kind of crossed a little bit over into the behavioral side of how a value might be played out, but it was the idea of allocation of space policies, valuing some sort of formal designation of how equitable space could be divided, and putting that into practice, particularly for prime time. Field time and ice time and such. The third one, we had a little bit of a discussion around, because very interesting work going on in Vancouver around decolonization efforts. And we heard about a document and an approach that many of you might want to connect with and have a look at as Van Play, it's called. And the value there is that this is something that happens across the organization. It's not a silo of here's decolonization efforts, but really it blends across as almost like a health for all sort of approach. And the fourth one was listening, and listening at all levels. And so we had people in our group from the federal government, we had people from local communities, and how important it is to value listening to people and what their needs are. And back to that allyship that we heard about for Netflix. So those were the main points.
Perfect.
The group, if anybody wants to jump in with anything else, feel free.
Okay. Let's go to group 2 in terms of what behaviors would support each of these values. And we discussed our values. We couldn't talk about behaviors without talking about values. So our values would be transparency, supporting diversity as being viewed that way, honesty, integrity, so integrity go together, and then a balanced approach, which I really liked. And so the behaviors were, in terms of transparency, that transparency applies to everyone at all levels of an organization and organizations, and that the transparency is communicated. So how are you transparent? By your data that you collect, by the satisfaction levels, et cetera. So there was that component. And supporting diversity, again, the team wanted to see a clear policy in terms of behaviors, and that there was some data collection around who is included but who is not included in our sport and recreation opportunities. And then the balanced approach was supported something that your group had said, Nancy, and that was around a balance so that you are including people who are just beginning a sport or recreation opportunity, but those who have more expertise, and but there was equitable allocation of space to support those elements. And I think that's what captures our group. Was there anything to add? Okay, we'll move on to group 3.
Gosh, maybe I spent more time on social hour. Okay, so what we talked about, ours was around the behaviors that would be not acceptable in this work together. So we talked about the use of inappropriate language. So derogatory language, language that's not inclusive, that maybe my 2 cents is, even when we ask people about the language that they want to use and we still don't. So that theme. We talked about tokenism. So many times we offer opportunities for people to join, but we don't then, it's not a, not legitimate, it's not the word, but it's not an authentic request, or we don't honor their contribution. So it's rather, again, more of a token approach. We talked about behaviors of other groups that we may partner with. Potentially they are sponsors who might not have the same values and beliefs as we do. So we have to be careful about that. We talked about comments that end up being about people's, whether it's clothing or looks or speech. Some of the things that I think Lisa talked about in her video from Sport England as well, and examples that were given. And then allyship, and it was described as sort of comments might be made, and it could be in a chat box, it could be in a meeting, wherever the case may be, and we need to be able to stand up and say that's not okay to have used that language or to have made that comment. So I think that might fall into the area of allyship. And so my group, did I miss anything? Feel free, or anybody else?
Okay. And the last group on barriers.
Hey. Okay, so in our group, on the barriers to sort of like committing to these new values and behaviors, one thing that we mentioned was now that we're all working remotes, being able to sort of like collaborate on some of these issues or initiatives together can be a barrier to sort of like making it run through the organization. Another thing would be the updating of materials within the organization. So once you've already implemented these new values, being able to update all the existing materials, both internally and externally, especially to be able to communicate to the public that you are now more inclusive. Another thing was holding staff training. So it's very important to be able to train staff on your new sort of like position, to help them with language, to help them with attitudes, and to help them understand the benefits of these new values. Some of these training would include things like being able to show promotional photos to help them see your organization actually being inclusive in the workplace and in your programming. One thing that we did mention, or let's say 2 things, was not being on ground to really see some of the issues that affect your programs can be a hindrance to this, because you're not really seeing how not being inclusive is impacting the people on ground. You're really just seeing the statistics. So there may be that disconnect in your organization. And also, if you work in a really small town or a really small organization, the people that you cater to, some of your initiatives or your plan may be too broad. So you have to be inclusive for everybody. You might not be able to hone down on very specific groups. So that could be another challenge. I don't know if I've covered everything.
So the next portion of our presentation is on, our workshop is on intersectionality. And intersectionality respects the fact that girls, women, and gender diverse people describe themselves differently and in multiple ways. And we, as service providers, really need to understand that and listen and learn how to best create welcoming environments, which may be different from community to community. The quote by Dr. Oni Blackstock, who's a primary care and HIV physician and a health equity expert in New York, is pointed. It says it's more about marginalized identities and intersecting systems of oppression. So this is what we are trying to address that typically persons with disabilities, women, persons experiencing low income, persons with varying backgrounds, gender diverse people, etc., have more challenges accessing services than most. So this is really what we're trying to, the point we're trying to get across on intersectionality. And the next two, we're offering 2 video clips describing intersectionality. One is a CPRA webinar on intersectionality from and including 2 panelists, Janelle Joseph, who's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, specializing in critical studies of race and ingenuity, and Donna Rosa, the general manager of the Vancouver Board of Parks and Recreation. Janelle will speak to intersectionality, and Donnie will speak to the importance of policy as a starting point. The full webinar on intersectionality, which these 2 clips are taken, can be found on the bench on CPRA's website if you're interested more in this topic. We'll also listen to a short video developed by the Canadian Women in Sport on intersectionality.
Intersectionality theory concentrates on the idea that all of us have multiple identities. And for some of us who are experiencing oppressions, exclusion, or injustice, it's not possible to think of those identities as distinct from each other. They're overlapping, they're interlocking, or as Black feminist legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw named in 1989, they are intersectional. So she uses this foundational case, an example of a legal case with a Black woman who was experiencing employment discrimination. So in the eyes of the law, Black women were unable to prove that the employer had discriminated against Blacks because Black men were being hired and in some cases promoted. They were unable to prove that women were being discriminated against because white women were being hired and promoted. And so when they stood at the intersection, if you really think about 2 roads meeting, the race road and the gender road, when they are at that intersection and they are experiencing exclusions, just thinking about the roads didn't help them. It wasn't just a race issue and it wasn't just a gender issue. We really need to think about the simultaneity, the compounding of the discrimination that they were experiencing. And we know that people have many identities other than just race and gender. And so for that reason, they might experience many different kinds of discrimination or oppressions. So if people are living with a disability or are visibly religious or living outside a gender binary or caregiving for others, and I could go on, we understand that adding up these identity categories or adding up these numbers of roads is not going to help us. It does not move us towards inclusion. We can't just keep adding different types of people. We have to think about the systems of exclusion that are based on these colonial histories and traditions, particularly within sport, recreation, and fields of related to leisure.
So you can see that just respecting people's different backgrounds and the way people identify influences our role as practitioners, because we need to understand how to create those welcoming and safe environments for people to feel even safe coming in our doors. And within this work, we need to have those community conversations, those surveys, those one-on-ones, et cetera, to even initiate some more gender or increasing gender equity in sport and recreation.
Intersectionality is a concept that can help policymakers and sport programmers understand how different types of discrimination, like racism, homophobia, and ableism, combine to prevent some women and girls from participating in sport. It's not always possible to see these obstacles when we consider gender alone. Ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender expression, age, and ability are all factors that can play a role in determining whether a person's experience of sport is positive and welcoming or whether they are excluded. Not all women and girls have the same needs, concerns, and desires when it comes to sport. To ensure that all women and girls can enjoy the many benefits of sport in an environment that is inclusive and safe, sport leaders need to look beyond gender to identify and dismantle barriers that can arise from overlapping forms of discrimination. Here are 3 ways you can start to take a big picture approach to gender equity. Review your membership and leadership to identify whether it is representative of a broad range of intersecting identities and experiences. If not, prioritize this for recruitment going forward. Be proactive in seeking opinions from women with intersecting identities to learn more about how factors such as race, ethnicity, ability, and socioeconomic status combine to impact their sport experience. And make sure to take action on what you learn from them. Promote and encourage public visibility for women and girls with diverse identities who hold key roles in your organization. For more, take the Gender Equity Lens training at womeninsport.ca/lens.
Thank you, Canadian Women in Sport. So as you can see, the key is to have representation on your staff and through your volunteer team that represent your community. And that in itself says to someone, I belong here. I am safe here. I'll be listened to here because there's somebody like me. And as well, that seeking the opinions is going to be key, is key. So I just have included this next table just to indicate that as a nation, we're very diverse, and then within communities to even greater extents. But females are 50% of the population, BIPOC 22, LGBTQI2S is 13%. And now that people are more open and schools are more welcoming and talk about this community, more people are indicating that they identify in this way. So we're seeing percentages that are much higher than they were in other census indicators. And there's another indication by CCES that 1 in 200 Canadians may be trans. So there's, this population that we haven't been as open and accepting and welcoming to, I think requires a lot more work. Persons with disabilities, with our aging population, we have even more older adults with disabilities. And how do we get women who are older adults or seniors, elders into our facilities when we know that they have significant barriers? Low income is 12% overall for the Canada, but we see many communities where that number is 25%. And to do this work with these varying backgrounds and understanding that there are intersections between and amongst them makes our challenge that much greater, but much more rewarding when we can see that we're providing programs and the community is taking up that initiative to include more. But again, I think it all does start with understanding who's in your neighborhood, who makes up the community, and hearing those voices. I'm going to share an equity lens, and it's a tool that we employ within staff and community teams when developing new programs and initiatives. Often departments make this lens a requirement as staff are pitching new programs, and it puts the accountability and the responsibility to consult and engage the populations, marginalized, underrepresented populations, that the program is designed for, but make sure that you've touched base with them beforehand. It's as simple as who did you engage? What did you hear? How did that affect the design of the program? What did participants say both during and at the conclusion of the program? So to ensure that there's some form of evaluation. And how did you measure the effectiveness, and what changes did you make or would you make in the future? The equity lens, if used consistently, will just be secondhand to staff and community groups and sport groups to make sure that they're providing meaningful opportunities for a diverse population. It's I've seen it employed to a significant extent more now in municipalities as there's greater emphasis on diversity, inclusion, and equity. Next slide I wanted to show you was the intersectionality framework. So it's a continuum of sorts, but you can start and stop at various places. And I would suggest, key if in a perfect world, you would focus on learning. And the E-Alliance is a research hub for gender and equity in sport, and has been developed this intersectionality framework. I like the framework and the continuum because you can start where you're at. If you already have a tremendous amount of learning and policies in place, you can start to move toward harm reduction and look at your policies and your practices that are creating more harm to the very folks that you want in your facilities. So it can be used by individuals, staff teams, community organizations, corporations dedicated to recognizing who we serve, and those people have differing and ever-changing identities. So one size doesn't fit all. We all have learning to do, and we need to take a closer look at our organizations, our policies, our terminology, our behaviors, our language, and our current practices. Because after all, our goal in recreation and sport is to fill our fields and facilities to capacity to make sure that there's equitable distribution of those, and that we're encouraging those that can't typically navigate these systems to participate. So we can't really address broadening our scope unless we engage those diverse opinions and that learning, the harm reduction, starting to take accountability for and transparency, which is one of the values we've just heard in our previous discussion, and how you're transforming as an organization. And then the continuum suggests that you will always have more learning, more harm reduction to identify and address better ways to be accountable and show that transparency. So it's a continuous improvement cycle. I think it's an excellent tool. And of course, the E-Alliance gives you much more detail on implementation, but I think it's a good tool to share. And as I said earlier, many corporations are developing those terminology guides for staff to understand terms. And I think that would be part of the harm reduction element, because people have said, certain phrases in meetings forever, but now there's a clear awareness that you could be offending people with these often colonial type phrases. So I'd like to also talk now about where do you think that your organization, your team, your community collective is along the intersectionality framework. And I think, MJ, you were going to apply the Mentimeter to this question. Terrific. So the vast majority are learning more and learning from each other.
We do have someone that is currently in the learning phase, but they are moving into the harm reduction phase.
Terrific. And I would say, where are you predominantly? But often enough, you're in many phases at the same time in terms of training, developing policies, terminology guides, etc. Two questions to be asked. What are the internal barriers related to intersectionality? So what would you be facing within your organization or a community group or community sport group? So is it being addressed? Do people know what it is? And how would you or have you addressed intersectionality in service provision? So it would be wonderful to understand if people have actually looked at intersectionality, engaged people with multiple backgrounds to talk about what that means in terms of service provision. But we'd also like to hear, how do you think, what's the best method of engaging folks and talking about this? So we'll all answer questions 2 and 3 in our groups, and we'll report back in about 10 minutes. Thank you. Nancy, would you like to kick it off and answer both questions? And then we'll go on to myself, Krista, and MJ, and we'll just add any additional thoughts.
Sure. So our group, in terms of the internal barriers, there was about 5 of them we came up with. One was the tendency to work for simplistic responses, avoiding the complex issues and looking just to solve the easy questions. A second one was referred to a group of box checkers in the organization, where they took the course, checked the box, and they figured they're done with that particular issue. Third one, in sort of a generational kind of context, parents who have come to the country, come as immigrants to Canada, are sometimes not as comfortable with the whole diversity inclusion discussion as their kids are. And so there's maybe a variance around different age groups. Fourthly, we had education on what is acceptable and not acceptable, how open people are to hearing that what they've said or done or whatever isn't quite current in terms of what's acceptable, and just the sheer amount of education that it does take. And then lastly, that to take from education to actually changing people's behavior in the way they speak or what they do is difficult. It's a big change in terms of behavior change. So that was it from the barriers. And then when we looked at the third question, or the second one here, how would you have addressed intersectionality and service provision, came up with 2 related. And if you remember back to that Mentimeter, that many of us in the group are in the learning stage still. So there wasn't a lot that people were already doing, but two areas came up. One in quite a rural community, even though rural, quite diverse in the population. And so their approach, which is early days, wanted to find out who they're not seeing, who's not participating in programs, and start the conversation with those groups, starting that where they are. So in this case, some of the adults were playing pickup basketball. So they had conversations with them about, well, what would your kids be interested in doing? So trying to find a way into that. And then the second example of that was sort of a fundamental shift in approach of, instead of waiting for groups to come to us that want to play something or rent a field or whatever it is, don't wait for that. Go looking for them. Who's not there? Same sort of approach. And first start to, the important first step was to build some relationships with these groups that haven't been engaged. So group, did you want to add anything to that before we move on?
Great. Thanks, Nancy. We talked about internal barriers, and one is the full department having a complete understanding of these issues, and just that learning curve that's needed around engaging people and understanding the makeup of the community. And so it's basically a mindset that needed to be created and supported. There was also talk about how COVID-19 has set some municipalities way back because of cancellations. They're not able to try new things. They'd like to have discussions, but many older adults, and one community was a Northern Ontario community, had a strong percentage of older adults and elders. And having those discussions is difficult because they're not that familiar with technology and don't necessarily have the bandwidth. So I thought that was interesting. And more learning was another one that we talked about earlier, and just resistance to change. And Mylene from Montreal indicated that they just introduced family change rooms as a change during and COVID, and it wasn't viewed as well as they thought it would be. So just preparing people for change, having those discussions would really back up these initiatives to a great extent. And then in terms of how would you like to better address intersectionality, basically having a mandate or a policy in place that gives you that permission to look at the makeup and include the full makeup of your community. Community champions being pushing and being the voice would make it easier from a staff perspective. And then just creating those discussions and in safe environments, and then continuous feedback loops. So it was felt once people were in were participants already, how could you be more welcoming? How could you be safer? How could you be inclusive of more people? And then again, the challenge was to include those non-users. Great, well, let's move on to Krista.
So in our group, and I think Claire, you've actually talked about some of the points that we discussed too. And I'll also just mention, so I'll give you the conversation broadly, but I think in our group, there was a feeling that this isn't a topic that's well understood or has been thought about, approached, that kind of thing. And so for one of the participants who works in a health unit, there is some awareness, and but also, as you mentioned, with older adults who may be providing some of the provision of services and so on, there's probably less of an understanding. So it's about how to reach all members of our community in terms of their understanding. We had a bit of a discussion about the fact that in some of our organizations, there's a very all-white staff. And I think we talked about this earlier as well. And I was just mentioning that one of the things that we're doing at CPRA is we're looking at a sort of a workplace or HR strategy for two reasons. One is the recreation sector has been hit very hard by the pandemic, and we've lost many staff. And so there's very critical shortages of staff across the country. But it's also giving us an opportunity to address the fact that we do tend to have very few from BIPOC communities. So part of our strategy is going to be looking at how can we ensure that more people who are enjoying recreation services or participating in recreation services are from different communities and feel welcome there, not just as participants, but also as staff, either short-term, seasonal, but also as a long-term career. So we're trying to make sure that we're addressing intersectionality through that lens. Policies came up as well in our group in terms of people not well informed on the topic. So we might need a top-down approach and some policies in place, training modules. Because I'd asked the question, what else could help? And we talked about training modules for staff, a language document where many people are concerned about not knowing the correct language. And I was going to mention later when I talk about our toolkit, we do have some resources on language. So I'll make sure that you know where those are. And I think that's it, unless I've missed something or my group wants to add anything.
Great. Moving on to MJ.
Thank you. I think in our group, we also spoke about the homogeneity of staff when it comes to addressing or at the facilities, and it really does affect addressing intersectionality in two main ways that we identified. Is either they don't know enough about the topic, like was said, or they don't take it seriously because they don't have that lived experience, or it doesn't impact them as it does in other communities. We also spoke about unconscious or conscious bias, either through, for example, their lived experience or things that they've seen online, particularly in a increasingly digital world where they're experiencing things that are outside of their communities and starting to sort of like take that on board. Whether or not it's a representation of their community or not, these are realities that we're living in. Also, there's the tendency to not want to do anything because the issue is perceived as too complicated. So the default would be just to do nothing in a bid not to sort of do the wrong thing. And also, we talked about when you're trying to address intersectionality or inclusion, there are not enough people in terms of absolute numbers that maybe have come up to talk about that topic. However, we said, when you look at it as a percentage of people from that community, it's a very high population. So in our group in Quebec, one of the consultations they had done, the people from that group were 85% of the population, whereas in absolute numbers, it's not a lot compared to the other sort of like non-LGBTQ plus in the community. But from that group, it's 85% is a huge number of people that don't feel represented in programming. Finally, we then talked about sort of like trends in facility building, and this helped us also talk about, what are people currently doing to address intersectionality. An example was in Templeton Aquatic Facility. It's sort of due for renovation and upgrading. And one of the considerations that they're looking at is that facility, based on the number of users, they do have quite a lot of people from the LGBTQ community that use it, as well as maybe people from other cultural backgrounds, because they found the place doesn't actually have a lot of windows, so they do feel more private, they feel more protected in those spaces. And the trends in architecture and facility building now is to make everything open, have lots of windows for people to look in and be enticed. So in trying to sort of renovate this facility, they're having to reimagine the way they would, build this facility to sort of move closer to the trend of architecture, but still be able to maintain the privacy and protectedness people feel in those facilities. And then the last thing we talked about is, helping people come closer to sort of the general consensus. So right now, we found that a trend is people are more open to universal changing rooms, but not as open to restricted programming. So for example, a women's only swim time, or LGBTQ only sort of like soccer time, people are more sort of like against that. So that's just something that we found within our group.
Interesting.
Claire, there is a comment in the chat that Rick has put up that's similar to the sort of staffing question that came up. But just wanted to point you to there.
Oh, could you read it out? My
Sure.
iPad isn't.
Sure. I would be asking why the vast majority of participants in this workshop are women. Great to see the men who joined, but were they directed or encouraged to participate by their superior? Should we be approaching recreation leaders to get their male staff involved in this process? What does this say about internal barriers?
Oh, what a great comment. Thank you for that. That gives us real food for thought. And probably the subject matter attracts a certain gender, but I would suspect that real leadership would encourage everybody to have this dialogue. So thank you for sharing that point. Thank you. Any other comments that people would like to make before we move along? Okay, the next section, which is our last, speaks to strengthening community commitment and gaining momentum through disrupting social norms and creating social hubs. The first is an introductory excerpt from our interview with Lisa O'Keefe from Sport England, and she's speaking to engaging community to strengthen community commitment.
When you think about engaging the community in physical activity and sport, what are the first three things that you would do to engage the community and develop a call to action to support females in sport and recreation?
The first thing I would do, and it sounds daft, but the first thing I would do is just be really clear who it is that I'm looking to engage, who it is that I'm trying to help become more active. I know it sounds silly, but I see a lot of sports and physical activity programs or facilities that are designed for everybody. And as far as I'm concerned, solutions that are designed for everybody are designed for nobody. And actually, probably even worse, not only are they designed for nobody, the people who thrive in those environments are the people who are most comfortable in them, and that's those who are already active. So that's my first message, be really, really clear who it is that you're looking to engage. My second message, and I would say this because I am an insight director, but I would say invest time and effort in understanding the individuals and the context of their lives. So what I mean by that, first of all, try and understand the individual. So understand their perception of their own abilities, understand their perception of the opportunities available to them to be active, and understand what motivates them. What is it they care about? What is it that they want in their lives? And how does sport and physical activity deliver that for them? So that is very much the individual focus. And for the first few years in this job, I spent all my time focusing on the individual and really understanding capability, opportunity, and motivation. What I realized over time was that that is too simplistic a view, because we don't live in a vacuum. So you have to understand the context of people's lives. And all of the time now, I take a system approach to understanding people's lives. So I ask myself about the social environment around them. Who influences them? Who are the people closest to them? What are they doing? What is normal in their environment? I work hard to understand the organizations and institutions who play a role in shaping their thoughts or influencing. So that could be school, it could be work, it could be a religious institution. You know, what are they? I try and understand the physical environment around them. How easy is it for them to access open space, safe places? Are the buildings that are available to them, do they feel welcoming? Would I go in there, you know, or do they feel like there are lots of barriers around them? And then finally, the policy context. So the policy in that place, whether it be local government, whether it be national government, does it support people being active, or does it create more barriers? So investing that time and effort in understanding the individual in the context of their lives really is the solution to all of this, because it opens your eyes then to what it's genuinely going to take to engage those communities, because they are very used to us just dropping in, parachuting in with solutions, and then we're off again. And it doesn't feel like they've been engaged in creating those solutions. And the third message I would say is that once you've really understood the individual in the context of their lives, really collaborate with them to think about what solutions, and work with them to develop the solutions that will overcome those challenges and barriers that they feel, and deliver on those motivations. Tell the story of what you've heard. Show that you care. Really engage them. Have a dialogue in that. And when you've developed then the solutions, again, share, because I see lots of examples of really fantastic facilities, programs, campaigns, but often the people we're targeting don't know that they exist, or that they've been designed for them. So you've got to reach out again. And I can't overemphasize enough, engagement takes time, but if you properly engage, first of all, you'll create new solutions, which might be really exciting from a career perspective. You will genuinely feel that energy and excitement from the audiences that you've engaged, and you'll come up with something different that works.
Great, thank you. So building commitment and momentum through online and physical social hubs. We've seen many municipalities have created social hubs where they engage a very comfortable space, have multi information opportunities where they have learning opportunities, or they provide connections to other organizations. And where they aren't available, people gather naturally. And I know if I wanted to engage with a group of Portuguese men every morning of the week, I could go to the corner of Dundas and Rusholme, and they gather. And so I think this is what Lisa's speaking to. You know your community, you know where people go. There may be story times at Starbucks. We've seen that programmed for parent and taught. So there are community hubs that are created, and some that are created naturally. As well, there are online community hubs, and as well, there are physical social hubs. And I think it's really a safe place where you feel welcomed and that you belong. and that you can share learning with others. And I think often these social hubs provide connections, provide opportunities for conversation, various supports. The Bench is, I think, an online social hub that CPRE has created. You can go online and speak to a community of people that understand you, that are engaged in parks, recreation, and sport, and ask questions, and you feel safe and welcome there. So it might be that we expand what exists already physically to reach out and discuss approaches, or we look at creating those online social hubs. I think libraries have done a great job of creating social hubs. Many community centers have done the same. But I think, libraries have had to recreate themselves in Ontario anyway. And I heard about this great approach. It's a newish service in libraries where you book a half-hour conversation with people in the community from diverse and varying backgrounds to ask questions in a safe environment. And what an opportunity that is for our own learning, to encourage others to learn, but just to have that safe conversation. And this might be a way for girls, women, and gender diverse people to be heard as well. Just an idea. Participation has an online social hub, in my view. You can listen to storytelling, be incentivized to be more active, etc. So I think that there are many online social hubs. I think one that has been developed specifically for women in sport or females in sport is See What She Can Do. And Carolyn Wiley is from Aurora, Ontario. She's the founder of the online hub called See What She Can Do. It's before you. She brings over 20 years of professional experience in sport and recreation industry, along with her passion as an action photographer. So her strong belief in the value of community and collaboration shapes all that she does in showcasing what active women are capable of doing and supporting businesses and organizations that are driven to help active people reach their full potential. But we're going to scroll through her website. She has 3 kind of communities within right now, and I know she'll expand as they come along, but Paramazing Circle, the Women and Dogs Circle, the Women and Coaches Circle. So you can jump on and see what others are doing and join in, and you're more than welcome to do that. Nancy, do you think we could look at Paramazing Circle?
Yep, MJ, you'll need to jump in on that one if you would.
Okay, great.
So
So Lisa captures all of the activity posted on, looks at what upcoming events are, and post upcoming events. She posts opinions from various and reviews by participants. She encourages others to post activities. So you can see, even we don't need to go in, but we can see Trail Women and Dogs Circle. We can see the Women Coaches Circle, Paramazing Circle. Here we go, Women and Dogs. So we're looking at what hikes women and dogs are going on in forest in January. They're having a forest hike, etc. So you can see these social hubs are safe spaces for everyone to join. Again, I think it's important to include diversity in your participants and pictures of diverse residents participating so people can see virtually that they belong in this group. So take a look at See What She Can Do. It is an excellent resource. It's not just a local resource, but we're showing you these because there's opportunities within your own community. And check out the Meetup social hub. It's an easy way for a community to promote their opportunities for women and girls, and get people to be active outside of sort of the mainstream of registering and participating. Thanks, MJ. We're going to talk about disrupting social norms. So we know that there are these beliefs in the community that are exasperating, but male dominant sports are more exciting. They get more media coverage, sweating is not feminine, etc. So how do we disrupt these? And I think the way to do it is to better understand it and look at ways to show it's not true. But the interventions are collecting data, identifying these gaps and looking at policies, continually working to change that narrative, and providing grants to align groups who may address access for females. Often starting with a conversation. And I have one example in my own family. One of my nieces is a trans woman. She worked at a golf course the summer before she came out. And the course she worked at was part of a larger conglomerate of about 50 golf courses across Canada and in the US. She wanted to get her job back, and she emailed her manager to explain that she now identified as a trans woman and hoped that her employment for the summer job was still available. The manager got back to her to say that they look forward to having her back on staff, and further that this large conglomerate of golf courses would be developing a corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion policy and training for all golf course staff, as well as sending communications to members about diversity at the clubs. And the manager further advised my niece that she could use any washroom or change room that she was comfortable using, and then to inform her if she received any derogatory comments from staff or golfers. I felt she was a trailblazer. She showed such courage. She felt she wanted her job back, and they needed to accommodate her. But it started with an honest conversation, and that was a hard conversation. So for setting up our organizations to be welcoming in the first place, people are going to feel safer about coming to us and helping us change that narrative. I'm going to give you a few examples in the next few slides around how people across Canada have changed and are changing the narrative around these beliefs. The first one is Brown Girls Outdoor World and changing the narrative through adventure. That was part of the pre-reading. I'm so impressed by Denisha Dennis. She started by, was a new Canadian. She's from Jamaica, and she felt everybody was doing outdoor activity, but they were not the same color, and they weren't from the BIPOC community. And she felt that was really familial influence, that her family didn't do these activities, but she wanted to be part of the Canadian experience. So she started the Brown Girl Outdoor World. The next just shows pictures of the types of things that they're doing. They have a social hub as a website. Anyone can join, be part of these activities. But here's the way, and they weren't provided any startup funding, although I was part of a fund development initiative to raise funds and equipment for them. And they really have done it self-sufficiently, met a need amongst themselves, are open to everyone else. I think this is an excellent example, and even the funds that CPRA has provided would fund exactly these things. And I think municipalities and communities and organizations need to take these things back to enable these changes at the frontline level, at the ground level, at the community level. The next approach that will help us change the narrative is around this Same Game Toolkit, the Canadian Women in Sport. And it's a toolkit that's been developed to help increase participation. And it provides practitioners with online training, program and aligned resources. So again, there's these tools out there that we have to let our stakeholders know about. There's so much that can be achieved through using these tools because that's, it's evidence-based. It gives you a continuum, especially with Canadian Women in Sport. They're there to walk you through your journey and help out. So I can't say enough about Canadian Women in Sport in terms of they've risen to the challenge. They have a tremendous amount of information, training, and consultation, and they're very dedicated and passionate about their journey and their goals. The next slide I want to talk about is Delphi Sporty Altergo, and this is a sporting event for para participants or persons with developmental disabilities. It happens on the South Shore. It's the largest annual multi-sport event of its kind in Canada on an annual basis. It's been successful for over 38 years. And it promotes athleticism, social inclusion, and universal access for children of varying abilities. Events are geared toward both newcomers to sport and elite athletes, so that balance again. And as a matter of fact, 40% of Quebec's Paralympic athletes started their sport experience by coming to these events. So you can see how this narrative has been changed by creating an opportunity for all children facing challenges. And each year, more than 5,000 athletes gather for 1 week of competition. And you'll see through this following picture how happy this little girl is to be part of a competition that she probably doesn't get to participate as often, as much as she'd like to within her own smaller community. And so during the pandemic, there was a hybrid model of virtual events, and they were broadcast on Facebook due to the pandemic. And the organization has developed a how-to manual in English for other organizations to undertake similar opportunities. And to me, that's inspiring. We didn't do a direct translation of this manual. It was basically using words that English-speaking Canada would use. But I think this is a stellar example how Quebec has shown that they can gather 5,000 athletes to a week-long event. And it's meant so much, not only at the level, the community level, as we see in this picture, but also on a national level in terms of para-athletes. Just going to share another best practice. If we look at recommendations in recreation and sport plans. So I spoke earlier about Aurora having a recommendation. This is another recommendation to increase female participation in sport and recreation. And this is asking the municipality to look at the numbers, engage in discussions with Cree groups, identify strategies to minimize barriers, and really work with other organizations to increase lifelong participation. So if we can, and further, we spoke earlier, if we only had a mandate to do this and that it was important, this becomes part of their work plan, part of the community, and the community had input into this plan, and council has the responsibility to ensure that this occurs. We have 630 First Nation communities in Canada, 3,100 reserves, 2,500 municipalities. You can see that we can expand this thinking through planning opportunities within provincial and territorial sport bodies. And there's thousands of chapters of organizations serving those with varying abilities. So I think it is all possible. At a very minimum, these are our partners in increasing gender equity in sport. But this is another example of give communities a mandate, and then they have the responsibility and accountability to all residents within their community. want to talk about where we go from here. So we have covered a lot of ground today. We have looked at intersectionality, building a strong culture, breaking social norms, social and online hubs. And I want to take some time, now we only have 10 minutes left, so we'll do this as a plenary. Let's share where you might take this important work within your organization or your sphere of influence. So I think what we'll do is, Nancy, if we can show the worksheet or the slide that includes the first 3 elements of the planning worksheet, I think we'll just in plenary cover those portions of the sheet.
So MJ, I think the next slide will address this. It's got all of the sections on it.
Yeah, so let's cover the first 3 and the next 5, and I think we'll wrap up for 5 and we'll call it a workshop. But we have talked about the current state of gender equity in your organization, and we can link that to the temperature check assessment. But let's talk generally in the room. What's the general state and what are the gaps in your organization? And is there an idea that has been generated today that you could start thinking about? So first of all, what's the current state? What are you doing? And if it's not doing much, please share that. What are the key gaps as you might consider that in terms of what we've learned today? And then how would you think about going forward? Give you a couple of minutes to think about it. But
Feel free to record in the chat box if you'd like as well.
Okay, great. And can you take a look for hands, Nancy, or people jumping in? Is there any sharing, any gaps that you want to talk about or any ideas that have been generated through today's discussions? I know it would have been much easier to get in the groups and hear from others. Any ideas that you'd like to explore more or even learn more? What we take away and look at doing as a result of our discussions today?
Claire, I would just mention CPRA is actually has just received some funding through a new, I think it's a new government department wage, and I'm not going to get it quite right, but it's basically women and gender equity. It's actually equality, I think is the term they use. Anyway, so we're actually going to be taking some of the ideas that we've heard today and incorporating some of that into what we're going to do for the next steps. But if out of this workshop, there are things that you've heard or that you would like further explored as part of our next project, which I think will be for a couple of years. It's interfering with my retirement. I just want to point that out. But let us know and we'll do our best to incorporate that. We have, although we've sort of promised or outlined some of our work, we have a lot of flexibility to shape this new project in a way that serves you the best. So would love to hear from people after the workshop, after you have time to reflect on what you've heard today, if there's something that we can help you with that might either be questions you're seeing in this planning worksheet, maybe it's around intersectionality and some of the tools. But anyway, I just throw that out there to say that, yeah, we have an opportunity to help with some of the stuff that you might need, some of which is covered or discussed on the worksheet or other things we've talked about today.
Terrific. Thanks, Krista. Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide around the gender equity toolkit. And Nancy, would you like to speak about that?
I'll maybe start, and then I'm going to pass it over to Krista to give a little bit more detail. I just want to point people's attention to the chat box that MJ has identified in there, the location of the URL for you to go to get the materials from today. We've referenced the planning worksheet. There were a couple of pre-readings that you didn't miss anything. They didn't go out intentionally. We decided to incorporate them into the workshop. So you'll receive an email after the workshop with both the French and English versions of the slide deck today, as well as the links to all the different resources that we've spoken to. So in terms of the toolkit, Krista, I'm going to point in your direction.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, we're excited. This has been a long time in the making. So we just launched the toolkit this week. It's on cpra.ca, and you'll find under initiatives on our website. It's under initiatives, and you go to gender equity, and that's where it will be. As Claire mentioned at the beginning of the project, we did do a literature review. We did a key informant interview, a number of key informant interviews and surveys. And there were a number of common themes that came up that were related to capacity building that would help people. Some of these skills would help people to do the work required to look at facility use and design. So initially we thought, when we were coming up with this, okay, how are we going to approach the whole topic of facility use and design and gender equity? But what came across is that communities are so different. And so that a one size fits all approach might not be the best way to go about it. But again, when we looked at the themes of what people needed, in order to figure out how to address facility use and design and other issues around gender equity, they really needed help with organizational capacity. And so that's the topic we've covered today, and that you'll find more information on the toolkit. Community engagement, which Claire will actually be talking about on March 9th. They talked about the need for evaluation, help to evaluate what they were doing, what they currently had, and what they were doing as a result of their efforts. That workshop will take place February 23rd, led by Nancy. And then there is one that actually discusses some examples of facility design, and that's on February 7th by our colleague Mary Chow. So we took a little bit of a different approach and in looking at facility use and design. And so this toolkit is meant to look at all of those areas of capacity building, all of the information that we talked about today, all of the, again, as Nancy mentioned, the slides in both English and French. So this website or this toolkit exists in both English and French. This workshop will be also translated or dubbed in French. So for those of you, to our colleagues, our Francophone colleagues, you will also have access to all of this in French, the temperature check, the worksheet, and then there's some other resources that we've been collecting along the way that will also appear under each of the 4 sections. And then we also have resources that don't fit into quite these 4 categories, and there's a bigger resource section in the toolkit, so you can access that. And then there's a spot where we've been starting to share stories. So we don't have them up yet, but the ones from Aurora that you didn't hear a clip from today, but there is one from that community, one from Nova Scotia, and then I've started to do some interviews with people. And if you have stories about the work that you're doing, then we would like you to send them to us, and we would love to feature them in our stories section of the toolkit. And then in this next project that I was talking about earlier, we are going to be continuing to develop this toolkit. So it's quite new and has a lot more that can be added to it. So anything that we find we'll put up there, but like, again, if there's anything that you have or you think should be included, don't hesitate to get in touch with us, and then we'll do that. So you can email me. I knew that question was going to come up. So it's Krista@cpra.ca. And Krista is CHRISTA. You can also send it to info@cpra.ca if that's easier, but I don't mind if it comes to me directly. So again, Krista@cpra.ca. And I think that's it, unless Nancy, if I missed anything, or MJ.
Oh, it looks excellent.
Okay.
Terrific.
I just added the email addresses to the chat.
Oh, thanks.
Terrific. Are there any questions about today's session? Anything with respect to content? let's move along to the evaluation. MJ?
So thank you everyone for attending today's workshop. You can complete the evaluation using the link that I'm going to put in the chat right now. You can also do this by scanning the QR code, or you will receive this in an email. So everything that we talked about today, the link to the recording, the slide deck will be shared with you in an email, but I'm going to put the link to the survey in the chat right now. So please take a moment to complete the survey. And
Thanks, MJ. I'd just like to thank, as MJ has, all of you for joining us today, and for Claire's work on this. We've been working on the workshop. We had a pilot of it in the fall, and the culmination of it today. So Claire, thank you so much for not only your expertise on this, but your time in bringing this to the group. So thank you so much. To the co-facilitators with Krista and MJ, thank you as well for your participation, but great kudos to the group. The small group discussions, as Krista mentioned, will be good fodder for our next steps with the project. So thank you for that. Claire, I'll leave the last word with you.
Thank you. Thanks again for everyone participating in our sessions. This is very worthwhile work. Given that women are over 50% of the population, I encourage you to start learning more, learning from people within the field, connecting with Canadian women in sport, looking at all of the tools that are available to you, and also just start small, but please start somewhere. Thank you. Merci. Merci. Miigwech.